Christmas was fun, but now that it's over, time to get back to business. Now, some of you may be aware that SRPGs, or strategy RPGs, are my favorite genre of games, and I know a few people who thought that this episode would be the hardest for me to write because they're my favorite genre. After all, pointing out the problems in my favorite genre is hard, right? In truth, this was the easiest episode of this miniseries to write, and it was so easy to write because strategy RPGs are my favorite genre. I've played so many of them that I've become intimately familiar with what I consider to be the genre's biggest strengths and the biggest problems. And no, the biggest problem facing the genre is not the introduction of casual mode in Fire Emblem. Accessibility is a good thing, and being an elitist snob about it helps no one ever. Phoenix mode sucks, though. So what is the big strength of the genre? Well, SRPGs mostly focus on tactical combat and grand, sweeping stories with a large scale. Combat generally revolves around using different classes of character to move across a map, taking major points and fighting a sizable army of enemies. Story, meanwhile, generally focuses on stories of war, since that fits the combat style the best. Stories about war are generally rare in the various RPG genres, so this is the best genre to see that in, at least for RPGs. However, the biggest problem with the genre are all on the gameplay front. Story-wise, they're generally okay with the odd mishap. See, SRPGs tend to be complicated games, so a fine line has to be struck between giving the player enough options for true strategic play, and not making the games overcomplicated, and not making any one strategy so much better than the others that not using it is just flat worse in every way. Now, to be fair, striking that balance is hard, and no game has a perfect balance, but sometimes it just gets completely out of alignment. Unfortunately, the biggest problem tends to be an odd form of overcomplication. Simply put, a lot of SRPGs offer the player too much choice, to the point where it becomes overwhelming and everything just blurs together. Disgaea and Final Fantasy Tactics are the biggest offenders, but Fire Emblem is beginning into this as well, ever since the series started adding reclassing and Shadow Dragon. The problem with this is that once you reach a certain point, the player has too many options to be able to parse them all with any kind of ease. So everything just kind of blurs together and things become samey. However, there's another side to this saturation of options, aside from making things overcomplicated. For players who do take the time and trouble to figure it out, it tends to make any need for strategy fall right out the bottom of the game, as the player frequently now has the ability to field however many of the strongest units as they want, instead of having to find a balance out of a set group of unit types. This creates two problems. First, for the easier parts of the game, they tend to become boring as the player just steamrolls across a map with a perfect set of units. However, the second problem is actually worse in a way. If the player gets to a point where the steamrolling is no longer viable, then they're untrained in the actual tactics and strategy need to take them beyond that point, and are likely to just quit the game, thinking they ran into an unfair difficulty spike. Things like this are the result of a player finding a low-skill strategy that works really well at first, but isn't actually that good in the long run. SRPGs are far from the most common home of that particular issue, admittedly, but I find when it does crop up, it's usually as a result of the player being able to field as many of a particular type of class as they want, and not needing to use the others. Now, this isn't the only problem facing the SRPG genre. The genre, in fact, appears to be shrinking as the years go by, with only really Fire Emblem and Disgaea as the two big franchises left, and the chase for accessibility is causing a few new issues, like the aforementioned Phoenix mode and Fire Emblem Fates, which just takes any need to any worry about strategy or even healing out of the game, since any character that dies is revived at the end of the turn. However, I do believe this oversaturation of choice and subsequent possible bottoming out of the need to actually strategize are the two biggest problems the genre faces. Now, as for how to fix it, personally, I think the best way would be to just kick the ability to have as many of a certain type of unit as you want in the head, but that's both too simple of a solution, really, and it would really screw with this guy's game design, so let's try a little harder to find a solution. Balancing the units so that none of them completely outpower the others is a good option, but that would be nightmarishly difficult, if only to keep the classes with healing and ranged options from flat out becoming the best. Believe it or not, I think the most practical solution is designing your maps and enemy placement in such a way that no single unit type can deal with all the enemies or challenges on a map. In fact, if you want to be really clever, use unit design for things like unlocking secret maps or characters. Have it so only certain units can pass certain types of terrain in order to trigger certain events. This alone would make certain units in games far more interesting. In fact, a situation like this is the only thing that ever made me use a fighter class in Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, due to them being outclassed by all the other axe-wielding units, in my opinion. This would encourage people to try out new classes that they might otherwise avoid, and sometimes that's all you really need to get people to think more about strategy and using it. There are other ways to do this, of course, playing with what kind of weapons a class is resistant or weak to, limiting the number of units per map, making weapons for the strongest units rare and breakable. There's a lot of ways to do it. You just need to be clever about it. And believe it or not, that actually wraps up this episode of For Fun and Profit. Sorry for the shorter episode, but this problem was both simpler to explain and simpler to suggest solutions for. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode. Thank you, and good night, folks.